Welcome, my Mercurial mercenaries! Just a quick discussion, as a bit of fun, regarding the length of time it takes various bands to produce their albums. This was inspired, in part, by an article I read on the interweb. So let's just read through it now together. This article is entitled, From King Gizzard to Tame Impala. This is an analysis of the most prolific artists and their counterparts who work at a glacial pace. Glacial? This is an article written by Luke Saunders for something called Happy Mag. A decade in review. As Andy Warhol once said, don't think about making art, just get it done. Let everyone else decide if it's good or bad, whether they love it or hate it. While they're deciding, make even more art. And if you're a fan of King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, or Tame Impala, you'll see where this article's going. If the last decade has produced anything praiseworthy, I'd like to think it did. It is two prevailing kings of Australian rock, Tame Impala and King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. With two wildly different approaches, they seem like the perfect touchstone for this debate. Tame Impala mastermind Kevin Parker released his now deified first album, In a Speaker, in 2010. His now deified first album, In a Speaker. Parker just released his fourth album, The Slow Rush, in 2020, perfectly capping a remarkable arc in his career. That's true, I suppose, for the purposes of this debate. If we're talking about a decade, 2010, 2020, and the albums in between. Lonerism, and Currents. So there we go. That's a decade in Kevin Parker's professional life, and personal life as well, I suppose. A decade, 10 years, 4 albums. All right? I can see where he's going to go here, but let's carry on. King Gizzard issued their debut 12 Bar Brews in 2012. So Kevin Parker, In a Speaker, 2010. 2 years later, King Gizzard released their first album, 12 Bar Brews, and released their 15th album, Infest the Rat's Nest, in 2019. So Kevin Parker, 2010 to 2020, 10 years. King Gizzard, 12 Bar Brews to Infest the Rat's Nest, 2012 to 2019. Was that really 2019? God, it seems more recent than that. Oh God, I forgot it was Red. 2019, yeah. 15 albums in 8 years compared to 4 albums in 10 years. So I can see where he's going here. Shh. More than 3 times the output of Tame Impala, Giz have a scope spanning a score of genres and identities. Their relentless abundancy, that which peaked in 2017 with the release of 5 albums, has earned them a rabid fan base of cult worshippers. That's going a little bit over the top. That sounds like a Charlton Heston film set in apocalyptic times. This is a zombie apocalypse right now, though. Really, King Gizzard should probably be releasing 5 albums now. Now people have got the time to listen to 5 albums. Did anyone have the time? Did truly have the time to listen to 5 albums in 2017 by one band? I came from an era where, if you were lucky, really lucky, a band might release an album a year. But when I think back to the bands of my youth, one album, they'd have an album, they'd do a tour. An album one year, a tour the next year. An album would come every 2-3 years. The issue is most fans can't necessarily engage, absorb, and love 5 albums a year. Okay, so he's just said what I just said. Being progressively prolific is both King Gizzard's greatest trait and biggest downfall. In the case of Giz, however, it is not art for art's sake. They take considerable care of each album, and they rarely feel like an afterthought. That's true. Ultimately, that is the main distinction to be made between success and excess. I see what he's done there. Success and excess. Prolificacy and profligacy. In that regard, it's rather remarkable. Stu Mackenzie has released more albums in 7 years than most professional artists do in their career. That's absolutely true. You'd be hard pressed to find a band that's released 15 albums. They exist. There are bands out there who have released 15 albums, but in 7 years, Kevin Parker, on the other hand, has released 4 award-winning albums in 10 years. I mean, awards are subjective. He makes an effort to say 4 award-winning albums here. So the fact that he's chosen to say that must mean that King Gizzard haven't won any awards. So they've released 15 albums with no awards, and Kevin Parker releases 4 albums with 4 awards. So now we're into the Oscar thing. If you won an Oscar, where are you going to put it? Everyone says, oh, where have you put your Oscar? I've put mine in the toilet. I go into the bathroom and it's on the shelf next to the electric toothbrush. And we've got to go, oh, that's great. That just shows a lack of respect for your Oscar. Well done, well done. Where would I, if I had an, I'd have to start acting first, but if I had an Oscar, where would I put it? I'd be tempted to put it in the understairs toilet, but I have a sneaking suspicion it would be on the mantelpiece, pride of place. Look at my Oscar. I might put a hat on it. I'd put it on the mantelpiece, centre of the room, centre of the living room, but then I'd ruin it by throwing a hat on it. Contrary, I know. Kevin Parker, on the other hand, has released 4 award-winning albums in 10 years. While they are exceptionally conceived works... See, this is all subjective. This is all subjective. We're saying that King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard are better than any other band who are prolific because they don't just chuck albums out into the world. They think about their albums. Their albums are meaningful. They're proper albums. All these other bands who chuck albums into the world, they're not as good as King Gizzard and Lizard Wizard. And TAME IMPALA, Kevin Parker, putting only 4 albums out into the world. Yeah, but they're not just 4 albums. They're exceptionally conceived works. And this idea that it takes you 5 years to release an album, therefore you must have spent 5 years working on it. It could take you 5 years to release an album, but you could have still spent 1 week working on it. Let's not go over the top here. While they're exceptionally conceived works, any artist can spend half a decade on one album. That's a weird statement to make. I remember the first time I read this article, I thought that was such a weird thing. Kevin Parker, on the other hand, has released 4 award-winning albums in 10 years. While they're exceptionally conceived works, anyone can spend half a decade on one album. Yeah, I mean, anyone can. Anyone can. Anyone can. In this street right now, you could have every resident of the street currently spending 5 years working on an album. Because anyone can. Yeah, anyone can. Anyone, honestly, anyone can release 15 albums in 1 year if you want. If we're not going to talk about the quality of the albums, I mean, anyone can spend 5 years on an album. Anyone could spend 10 years on an album. Anyone could spend 5 minutes on an album. No, probably not 5 minutes. It'd be a very short album. While there are exceptionally conceived works, any artist can spend half a decade on one album. Only a finite number can proliferate the luxuriant output of King Gizzard. Only a finite number can proliferate the luxuriant output of King Gizzard and the Lizard. Look, there's some truth to that. It's not easy to put 15 albums out into the world, the majority of which are good. So there are only a finite number. I'm not quite sure why there's only a finite number who can put a lot of decent albums into the world, but anyone can spend half a decade producing an award-winning album. That, Luke Saunders, although I'm getting the gist of what you're saying, I'm not necessarily disagreeing, that last statement you made, Luke Saunders, is bullshit. Bullshit. Thus, to cement the words of Warhol, it is far more important in today's industry to be prolific than perfect. Lots of people have argued this, to be fair, over the years. In this ones and zeros streaming age, lots of people say it's better just to keep chucking a song into the world. Do it every month, every week, every day. Just chuck a song here, there, chuck song on YouTube. All of it's a new song by so-and-so. Don't put an album out. Don't spend 5 years making one album and putting it out. Just take works. Chuck. And that's what King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard are doing. Now, has that earned King Gizzard, because this is what Luke would be getting at here, has chucking 15 albums out into the world, rather than 4, has that made King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard a more successful band than TAME IMPALA? Has it? Because the people who say chucking stuff out into the world is where it's at, the way to prove that right is to say that Because there are only 4 albums here, Kevin Parker is not as successful. He cannot be, as a matter of fact, cannot be as successful right now as a band who put 15 albums out in less space of time than him. Because it's all about prolificacy, and it's about chucking songs out into the world, chucking videos out into the world, never giving anyone space to rest, just reminding you constantly, we're here, we're here, we're here. We're King Gizzard and Lizard Wizard, we're here, we're here, we're in your face, we're in your face, don't forget us, don't forget us. Don't rest for 5 years because we'll forget you. Because no one sat around since Currents going, oh, I forgot, oh, do you know what? I don't think I can be arsed with Tame Impala anymore. Can't be arsed with them, it's been years. I'm not interested in... That's not how it's been at all. I've been on the interweb. I saw the build up to the Slow Rush. I saw that there was a true longing, a wanting from the fans. And when it comes to who's more successful, now, artistically, who's more artistically successful? Stu McKenzie or Kevin Parker? Let's not get into the artistic merits. Which album do I prefer, Infest the Rat's Nest or The Slow Rush? Let's not go there. But let's just talk about success. Let's talk about what I've heard that Kevin Parker gets up to, the production work he's done, the working with the likes of Rihanna. I would say there isn't a great argument to say that King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, because of their prolificacy, are more successful than Tame Impala. I would say probably the counter is true. And if the counter is true, then that makes this article a bit redundant. He brings up other examples here. He talks about Frank Zappa, who apparently had 62 studio albums in his lifetime, and after he died, another 49 posthumous albums were released. Now, look, you can make 62 albums, 62 plus 49. You can make over 100 albums. Some of them might be good. Has anyone got the time to listen to 100 albums by somebody? That might not necessarily be a valid argument. There are probably some people out there who would love to have 100 albums by their favourite artist. If, like me, you consider Grace by Jeff Buckley one of the greatest albums of all time, then it's a little bit disappointing to only have the one album from him, because you didn't know where he would have gone. You had hints at it from the posthumous releases, but you didn't really know where he could have gone. But would I rather have one Grace or 100 Frank Zappa albums? I don't know, I'm just putting the question out there. Luke brings up Radiohead, one of the most celebrated, scrutinised and likely overrated bands in history. Let's just read that. That caught me by surprise. Let's just read that again. Radiohead, one of the most celebrated, true, scrutinised, true, and likely overrated bands in history. This term overrated again. I still get comments coming in on my Beatles video where I said, I was kind of having a go at the people during my life who have said to me, the Beatles, most overrated band ever, mate. They're overrated, the Beatles. When it comes to bass players in history, Paul McCartney was a fine bass player. And when you're talking about guitar players, you could do worse than George Harrison. John Lennon's vocal was once, I think it was Rolling Stone magazine or something like that, was the most iconic rock vocal voice of all time. When you're trying to downplay the qualities of the individual members of the Beatles as artists, yeah, I suppose when you're talking about bands, a band who gets on stage and sweats together and they're tight and they're the likes of Led Zeppelin and Cream, yeah. But I think Beatles probably in their Hamburg days and their cabin days, playing multiple gigs a day, they must have been tight. Fighting fit band. When it comes to comments like, the Beatles are overrated, Cream had far better songs. Cream, did Cream have far better songs than the Beatles? Did Led Zeppelin have far better songs than the Beatles? I'm a Led Zeppelin fan, alright? Take away the songs that Led Zeppelin covered or copied, and you're still left with some great songs. But to have an argument that Led Zeppelin's songs were better than the Beatles, I just think... So let's go back to my point here, which is Luke makes a weird comment here, weird to me, and I'm sure there's people out there, you have to sort of set aside whether you like the band or not, because I could still stick up for bands that I don't like. Radiohead, one of the most celebrated, scrutinised and likely overrated bands in history. Why would you likely overrated bands in history? But why would you say they're overrated? I go back to my Beatles point really, which is, what more do you have to do to be rated? You produce the Benz, OK Computer, you change everything with Kid A, you keep evolving, you keep stepping it up, and then someone goes, you're overrated, mate. I'd be like, what more do I have to do? Radiohead have made a career out of labour-intensive studio works. Spending many years on a single album in relentless pursuit of perfection has paid off in spades and rewarded listeners with some of the most emotionally intelligent music of the last few decades. Well, at least, so Luke is sticking up for the band there. I'm not sure why he's making the comment about them being overrated. OK Computer, Kid A, Amnesiac and In Rainbows are arguably all masterpieces released from 1997 to 2007. Why are you saying they're overrated, Luke? Akin to Kevin Parker's methodical approach, certainly aiming for earth-shattering conceptual new heights with every subsequent release. As with Tame Impala's fourth album, there is an inherent indulgence of time. The slow rush took 5 years to come to fruition, certainly living up to its name. I think that was the point. In a world of instant gratification and mass ingestion, we need more creation and less consumption. Do we? We need more creation and less consumption. You need people to consume the works you create. Hell. I feel like I'm on a different planet. Right, and then he ends his article with a sentence that made me record this video. Everyone can release one album in 5 years, but not everyone can release 5 albums in 1 year. I'll repeat that. Everyone can release one album in 5 years, but not everyone can release 5 albums in 1 year. Right. Technically, yes. Depending on the quality of the album. If we're not taking the quality into account here, technically, everyone, my mum, possibly my cat, he'd struggle with his paws. Everyone can release one album in 5 years. But not everyone can release 5 albums in 1 year. I would dispute that. Everyone, if you set your mind to it, could also release 5 albums in 1 year. To release 5 albums in 1 year in itself is really not that big a deal. I was bringing up my own examples here. I brought up the fact that in his most prolific time, the Alice Cooper Band, between, what have we got here? I would say my favourite Alice Cooper albums, one of the greatest albums of all time is Love It to Death by Alice Cooper. But in 1971, the Alice Cooper Band released Love It to Death and Killer, 2 fantastic albums. 1972, School's Out. 1973, Billion Dollar Babies, Muscle of Love, or forget Muscle of Love for a minute. So Love It to Death, Killer, School's Out, Billion Dollar Babies. 4 amazing albums in the span of two odd years. And they're all good. And then you get a band like Pink Floyd during the era that I consider the greatest, which is Dark Side of the Moon, 1973, Wish You Were Here, 1975, Animals, 1977, The Wall, 1979. A little bit of more of a time span there. Perhaps you could compare King Gizzard to the Alice Cooper Band and Kevin Parker to Pink Floyd. But in terms of arguing that it's inherently more difficult to release more work into the world, I'm not sure. When it comes to bands chucking music into the world, I quite often think there is an argument for taking the best tracks off some of those albums and just reducing it down. When Guns N' Roses released Use Your Illusions 1 and 2, if they just released one album with the best tracks, perhaps that would have been an Appetite for Destruction rivaler. King Gizzard and Lizard Wizard on the 5 albums in 1 year stretch. There's an argument at least. I'm not sure that I would bow to the argument, but there's an argument. Imagine if it had just been one double album, one kind of their King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard White album in 2017 with the best tracks from the 5 albums. There's an argument that it would have been easier to consume Although Luke doesn't want consumers, he just wants creators, but easier to digest. Could Kevin Parker chuck more songs out into the world? He probably could. I would suggest he definitely could. But he doesn't want to. So which approach is the best? Write down below, my mercenaries. Which approach is the best? Which do you consider the most successful? Which would you do yourselves? Which do you prefer? Do you prefer more music? Or do you prefer less music? Let's say it's good. Let's say it's all good. Do you prefer more good music being constantly chucked at you? Or do you prefer someone to just dish it out at a more reasonable pace? Do you want more? Or do you want a laugh of thin? Are you going to boom? Or are you going to go like that? You tell me. Thank you. Over and